I do not in any way mean to trivialize the myths that have brought humanity to this place. In fact, quite the opposite. If we had a mind virus that was affecting huge fractions of our population, so they were wasting large amounts of their time and resource on beliefs that weren't true and weren't profitable, then it would be wise to reduce the amenability of the mind to culture, and that's not what happens. Somehow, human beings seem to be getting their genes into the future doing things that do not immediately suggest a way in which they are helpful. Those myths are the key to our success. It is not reasonable to treat them as mind viruses or as ephemera. They are neither. They are crucial adaptations fundamental to human success. Niche switching is the human niche. We are the creature that deals with novelty. We are the creature that can find ourselves faced with a continent full of puzzles and figure out how to solve them. But how does it work? Hey folks, great to see so many of you back, and to any who weren't here last night, welcome. I did want to start with a reminder or two of some themes from last night, just so you know where we're starting from. I argued that the universe, the cold, inorganic universe, has selection built into it, and that predisposes it towards the evolution of life. As soon as you get something like heredity combined with the selection that exists in that universe, it kicks off the evolution of striving, which is the thing that unites all living creatures. That striving is, I was going to say for better and for worse, but it's really almost just for worse. That striving is all entirely about creatures getting their genes into the future. And I argued that getting your genes into the future doesn't mean you as an individual necessarily. It means you as a lineage. And you as a lineage is sometimes you as an individual, but there are a lot of levels of lineage, and the striving must involve getting a lineage's genes into the future. That's what it's evolved for. And all of the diversity of life is therefore explorations of different strategies for accomplishing that goal. I'm not defending this as a good thing. I'm just saying that I believe that that's what is. I believe it is nearly tautological that that's what's going on here on planet Earth. And I left you with a question, which is, if we are to imagine that all of that variation in the strategies about how to get one's genes into the future, whether it's your individual genes or your lineage's genes, well, then what are we to make of culture? Because culture seems to be an evolving landscape. Certain cultural traits get into the future, other cultural traits don't get into the future. Are they competing with genes for access to the future, or is there some other relationship? And I pointed out that we have a conundrum with something like the Cathedral Notre-Dame, which took more than 100 years to even open up. It took 600 years to actually be complete. And that raises questions about the individual, for example, the Bishop of Paris, who decided to build it. In what way was he getting his genes into the future? He couldn't even reproduce. He was a bishop. And he was making a decision in which the completion of the project wasn't going to happen until long after he was dead. And of course, the idea of lineage hints at an answer to this, which is that his genes were traveling in a much larger number of individuals, and that cathedral somehow facilitates the propagation of their genes into the future, which thereby inherently carries his genes along with it. So there are many different levels of lineage, and selection is somehow deciding which one to prioritize at any moment. That's a part of the evolutionary story that we have to get used to thinking of. Now, Notre-Dame is, of course, not singular. It is a very special place, but there are lots of very special places on Earth. This is Tikal in Guatemala, one of the most remarkable Mayan sites, and I would say to Ralston students who have spent so much time thinking about Greece, you really owe it to yourself to go check out the Maya in person if you can. Their civilization was absolutely incredible, and the number of parallels to the Greeks is substantial. It's well worth your time to do it. But here you have another monument that creates a similar mystery for us. This is a temple. It was not involved in the production of something like food that we could easily understand its relationship to propagating genes into the future. It was a purely ceremonial entity, and in any case, we could go around the globe looking at such examples. Somehow, human beings seem to be getting their genes into the future, doing things that do not immediately suggest a way in which they are helpful. Now, I want to add a tool to our toolkit. It's something Heather and I call the omega principle. And the omega principle, we've chosen the Greek letter omega. It's actually a reference to the Greek letter pi. The Greek letter pi describes the precise relationship between the diameter and the circumference of a circle. It is invariant. It doesn't matter what circle you're looking at. Pi is always the same number. Omega is the relationship between epigenetic phenomena. That includes culture, so I'm just going to say culture from here on out. The relationship between culture and genes. And our argument in using omega here is that that relationship is equally obligate as the relationship between the diameter and the circumference of a circle. It cannot vary. Now, the relationship between culture and genes has two parts. The first part is that culture is superior to genes because it evolves faster. And the reason that it evolves faster is that it can move horizontally. Now, you should not get too carried away with the idea of horizontal movement of culture, that is, between individuals rather than parent to offspring, between peers, because most culture, even though culture can move horizontally, most culture is passed vertically, passed parent to offspring, just the same way genes are. But because it can move horizontally, ideas can spread across a culture much faster than they could propagate parent to offspring. And so it is a radically sped up form of adaptive evolution. Now, that's a key to understanding why it happened. But let me give you the second part of this obligate omega relationship. Culture is superior to genes because it evolves faster. It is inferior to genes in that it is obligated to serve their objectives. Again, not a good thing, in fact, quite a bad thing, but nonetheless an obligate thing. It is wise for us to recognize the existence. Now, this is really a tautology, and the reason that it is a tautology is that culture only happens because the genes create a brain that is amenable to it. You can try to pass your culture onto a tree. It's not going to work. A tree is not capable of taking it up or willing. Human beings take up culture, as do many of the creatures that Heather was talking about, the usual suspects. They take up culture because it is in their interest to do so. And that is a very interesting thing because the hazard of being unprogrammed to a large extent at birth and taking on a lot of what you are culturally is that there are a lot of things that can go wrong with that process. You can pick up culture that isn't a full package. You can be incomplete. You can pick up bad data. Whatever can happen can interrupt your ability to be successful. So it's a very dangerous process, which suggests it must be tremendously profitable to overcome all of the downsides. Now, if it were true, as, let's say, Richard Dawkins argues, that things like religious culture is a mind virus, then what would happen is the genes would shut down the amenability of the mind to pick up culture. If we had a mind virus that was affecting huge fractions of our population, so they were wasting large amounts of their time and resource on beliefs that weren't true and weren't profitable, then it would be wise to reduce the amenability of the mind to culture, and that's not what happens. So we can assume from all of this that that culture, however strange it may be, is on average serving the interests of the genes, which is why they are leaving the door open to it. That is effectively a tautology. So we need some more tools in order to think about the question of human beings fully. One of them, I should probably tell you what that weird image on the screen is, otherwise you're going to be confused by it. You are looking at tent-making fruit bats. These were the focus of my dissertation. I'm very fond of these strange critters. You are looking upwards into a tent, and you can see that kind of rough ring there. That is a place where an animal, a bat, tore the structures of the leaf in order to get it to collapse into a structure that protects the animals, that hides them, that keeps the rain off. It builds this tent in the forest. These things are actually incredibly common, though most people who work in these forests don't know it because they're so hard to see that you're just walking by them without awareness. In fact, here is what it looks like from the side. It just kind of looks like chaos. You have to learn to spot them. Okay, so why am I using this picture? Well, it has two things in it that I want to provide a test to see whether they are a product of adaptive evolution. It is useful to have a test to see whether or not something falls into this category so we know whether we can use evolutionary tools to explain it, or that would be an incorrect thing to do. So one, we have the tent itself. Is the behavior of producing these structures in the forest the product of adaptive evolution or not? And the other, same question, is, I don't know if you can see in the image, but each of these animals has a little fleshy appendage sticking off its nose. It's called a nose leaf. Looks like it might have cartilage or bone in it. It doesn't. It's a very flexible little object, and I won't delve into the amazing story of what it's for, but nonetheless, you could ask the question, does this appendage on the face of these bats, is it the product of adaptive evolution, or is it maybe have some other explanation? Now, the test for whether something is or can be presumed to be the product of adaptive evolution works like this. It has 4 parts. If a trait is complex, if the trait is expensive, it costs something either in materials or energy or time to build, or it's risky to build. If it's variable, the amount of it that each individual has is variable, and yet it persists over evolutionary time, we should assume, if it passed that test, that it is the product of adaptive evolution. And the reason is because if it's expensive and it persists over evolutionary time, despite the fact that some animals have more of it and some of them have less, what that's telling you is that selection could have reduced the amount of it that animals spend, but it doesn't. So it must be paying its way. That's the logic here. And so if we look back at this sea otter that I showed you yesterday, and we look at him banging this rock on the clam, we can just simply ask ourselves the question, is this adaptive? Well, we should presume that it is, because it passes the test. The behavior is complex. It involves an incredibly intricate neurological architecture to accomplish. The amount of it that otters do varies between them. It takes time and energy, and yet it has persisted over millions of years. We should presume it is the product of adaptive evolution. Now, here's the key. Is that trait passed to baby otters in the genes or culturally from their mothers? The answer is we don't know, and we don't need to care. Once we know that the omega principle is a tautology, what we can say is it might be interesting to know what fraction of it is genetic and what fraction of it is cultural, but it is not required in order to answer the question, is it a product of adaptive evolution? We can say yes, it is presumably a product of adaptive evolution because it passes the test, and it doesn't matter what the admixture is as between being passed genetically and passed culturally. That's going to become very important when we get to people. And speaking of people, I would just point out that we have innumerable behaviors and structures produced by people that we could run them through this adaptive test and they would pass with flying colors. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about building ceremonial structures in the jungle, as the Maya did, building giant cathedrals in Europe, ceremonially burying our dead, music, dance, humor, all of these things pass the adaptive test, and we should presume that however mysterious their benefit might be, that it exists sufficiently for the genes to have facilitated the culture that allowed them to accumulate, be modified, and amplified. So, this tells us a little bit about what kind of a creature human beings are, and it begins to let us understand why we are so special. And really, I think Heather's lecture beautifully illustrated that as much as human beings are unique, we are wildly extreme in many regards where we see precursors in other animals that we can easily recognize. So the key thing that makes us different is a tremendously elaborated system of dual inheritance. When you are born, you are incomplete. The reason that we have the longest childhood of any creature that has ever existed on this planet is that it's worth it. Worth it because it allows you to take on a software program that can be adapted to your moment in space and time in a way that it could not possibly be if it came to you through your genome. So that opens the door to the radical specialness of human beings, and it is well worth understanding how it works. Now, you all will recognize this as a Google Earth image. I want to highlight a feature of it that probably has bypassed your notice each time you've looked at Google Earth. If you'll notice on this image, you're looking, if you're not spotting it right away, you're looking at the Bering Strait. You can see Alaska. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but you see the Aleutian Islands here. This is Alaska. Here we have Canada, and North America is this way. So what I want you to notice is that large, undifferentiated light blue section in the Bering Strait and extending around all of the coastlines. It's very narrow along the coast of North America, and there's quite a lot of this undifferentiated blue in the Bering Strait. What that is continental shelf. And continental shelf is a term we don't spend enough time teaching people about. Continental shelf is actually land. It's land that emerges from the ocean during an ice age. So what happens during an ice age is that conditions cool such that precipitation that lands on land stays there. And when it stays there in the form of ice, sea levels drop. And when those sea levels drop, all that continental shelf emerges from the sea. And what that means is that there's a continent in the Bering Strait during an ice age that disappears during an interglacial. And interestingly, that continent had a population of people living on it during the last ice age. It's counterintuitive because you would think it would be just ice everywhere. And it was in fact a cold grassland with a population of hunter-gatherers living there. The landmass is called Beringia, and so we call the people who lived there Beringians. We think there were a few thousand of them. Now, they would have been primitive hunter-gatherers from Asia. They would have had no ability to farm, no knowledge that it was possible. They wouldn't have had a written language. They would have had control of fire. They would have had flint-knapped tools. And they were in this landmass over what may have been thousands of years during the last ice age, and then the last ice age began to come to an end, and the waters began to rise, and that put them in a predicament. Their land was going to disappear. And there are two things that you could do. You could either go west, back to Asia, where there are lots of people filling up all of the habitats of Asia, or you could face the giant sheet of ice that was sitting over northern North America and maybe try to get past it. Now, we don't know what happened. There is no record of their discussions with each other. We don't know how many went west and how many went east. But what we believe is that a small fraction of the people, the Beringians, faced this sheet of ice that was retreating from northern North America to see if there was something beyond it. What they found when they got beyond it, they would have emerged effectively where Olympia, Washington is right now. The reason we say that is because Olympia, Washington is the farthest south point that the finger of glacier that extended down into the Puget Sound reached. So at the point they got to what is now Olympia, Washington, they would have found something very surprising. They would have had a vista in front of them that was not a barren wasteland scraped by ice down to rock where they wouldn't know what to eat. They would have found an incredibly fertile landscape of creatures. Most of them would have been completely foreign to them. They would have no idea of how to profit in this place, but it would have been obvious that human beings certainly could, and they would have had to figure out what to do. Now, this vista that they would have seen was actually much better than they could possibly have imagined, because what they were staring at were two continents devoid of human competition. This is like the biggest win a human being could possibly have, right? You were eking out a living, right up in the Arctic, and then suddenly you're faced with 2 continents with innumerable different ways that you could make a living. The population was going to go from maybe a couple hundred people who came south of the ice, and by the time the Spaniards arrived in 1492, there were something like 50 to 100 million descendants of that population living in the New World. They had invented hundreds, maybe thousands of different cultures, eking out a living in different ways in different habitats. And so what I want to try to elucidate is a model for how the very special creature that we humans are could possibly have done that. How do you go from a band of people who has control of fire and some crude flint-knap tools to being a Mayan who has higher math, the ability to predict the location in the sky of Venus, the ability to grow agricultural crops on poor tropical soils by chemically enriching them? These were very sophisticated people, and they discovered all of the things that they discovered independent of all of the things that were happening in the old world, all of the simultaneous discoveries of farming. So simple hunter-gatherers to sophisticated civilizations with mathematics, astronomy, religions of their own. How does that work? By the way, this is an artist rendering of what Beringians might have looked like. Okay, so I want to give you a model that Heather and I elucidated in our book, a model for this special aspect of humans. It involves an oscillation between 2 human modes of being. And this oscillation, we argue, allows human beings to do something that other creatures can't do. If I ask you what the human niche is, you'll have to scratch your heads. What does that question even mean? Humans have done thousands of different things. There is no human niche. What you probably don't realize is that that makes us unique among species. If I say, what is the niche of a wolverine? Well, the answer is that a wolverine has an extremely large territory where it can survive the winter by finding animals who have died mostly of starvation during that time period. We define the animal. That tells you the niche, because there's a one-to-one relationship between an animal and a niche, whether that niche is broad or narrow. Animals don't do a wide variety of things. Human beings do. So in some way, we have changed our ecological nature, and we have become a creature that switches niches for a living. It's what we do. We are the creature that deals with novelty. We are the creature that can find ourselves faced with a continent full of puzzles and figure out how to solve them. But how does it work? Well, think about it this way. A population does have a niche. A population may profit by collecting the salmon that return in the fall from being out in the ocean, and you can store those animals by drying them out, and etc. Or you may hunt caribou, or you may pull swiftlet nests from high up in caves in China. So you can do a lot of different things, but in each habitat, there's going to be an edge, right? Whatever it is that's good to do in the center of the habitat becomes marginal as you get to some place where the plant in question doesn't grow so well, or the animal in question doesn't get there, something along those lines. Or maybe your niche is humming along, and then the climate changes, and suddenly the things don't grow so well because it never gets warm enough in the summer. Whatever the answer is, the wisdom of the ancients varies in its ability to inform us about how to live. That which our parents knew is sometimes exactly the right stuff that we need to know for us to do the same trick. And sometimes the wisdom of the ancients, because it's from the wrong place or because it's from a time that was different than ours, is not useful. We have a tool for addressing such conditions. That tool is consciousness. Our conscious mind is a tool for dealing with novelty. You are not supposed to have to use it for mundane questions. It is supposed to be reserved for those situations where there is an important problem to be addressed and nobody knows the answer. And for reasons I won't elaborate too much here, you're welcome to ask about it in the Q&A. Heather and I believe that consciousness is misunderstood when we study it academically, because we all have a personal relationship with it that is very intense. I know my consciousness very well. The next nearest person to me, I assume they have consciousness. They certainly speak as if they do, but I don't have the kind of relationship. It's not as visceral to me. Similarly, you can't put a group of people into an fMRI machine. You can put an individual in there. So anyway, we've come to study consciousness as if it's an individual phenomenon. And as an individual phenomenon, it's kind of paradoxical. It's a strange way to go about things, to mull them over in deliberate terms. But as Heather and I define the term, consciousness is that portion of cognition that is packaged for exchange. Conscious thoughts are thoughts that you could tell somebody if they asked you or you felt like it. Doesn't mean you necessarily convey them, but it means that you could. You know, how much force I need to put into various muscles to lift my glasses is not a conscious thought. I couldn't report it if I tried. I don't know. But if you ask me, what are you thinking? I can report whatever is going through my mind. So the model is this. During times when the ancestral wisdom is accurate enough to work for your situation, you take on the cultural package that you've been handed by your ancestors and you apply it, and maybe you upgrade it. Maybe you discover things they didn't know, which you add to that cultural package. But at moments when your cultural package does not explain how to solve the problems you are faced with, you switch modes into consciousness, a consciousness that allows you to pool your insights between people. The reason that consciousness seems to overlap that which we can report is that language is useful for conveying its content. And when we convey its content, that allows us to do something very special. We can parallel process a problem. And that is why you see a picture of a campfire on the screen. Campfire is where people, at the end of the day, when their eyes aren't so excellent at figuring out how to make a profit, can get together and talk about whatever it is that they've been thinking about. Those Beringians who came south of that sheet of ice and found 2 continents full of puzzles to solve would have gotten together around campfires, and they would have described things that they had noticed. I saw a creature today. I don't know how you would hunt it, but I wonder if this technique might work, right? That kind of discussion. And in doing that, this group of individuals, this lineage, would be able to solve problems that it did not already have the answer to by parallel processing it and then prototyping a solution, trying it out, returning to the campfire and saying, well, that didn't work so well because, on the other hand, maybe we could do it this way. That ability to share thoughts between minds and parallel process answers allows you to bootstrap a new niche. You bootstrap a new niche. You figure out, here's how we're going to feed ourselves. And then you start improving it. That initial new niche, that's a prototype. And then that prototype starts getting better as you gather around the campfire and figure out what you're missing. And at some point, that new way of being is so dialed in that it gets driven back into the cultural layer. It gets packaged into stories that allow it to be transmitted very efficiently to new generations, which it will be. It will be transmitted very efficiently to those new generations so that they can start deploying it and spreading and seeing how far that wisdom can go. But what do we make of this? That's Zeus. Zeus is not a literal person. Zeus is a story. He is a feature of culture. What I'm arguing is that stories like the story of Zeus are the product of this process by which human beings find a niche and then figure out how to package the information so it can be efficiently transmitted to new generations. And what Zeus is trying to tell us here is that packaging information so that it can be transmitted to new generations does not come in the form of an instruction sheet that literally tells you what to do. It comes to you in the form of much more interesting stories that capture your attention, that explain things in ways that they cause your emotions to become supportive of your memorizing them, so you can avoid the pitfalls when they show up because you remember, narratively speaking, what they were. So what I'm arguing is that this process of culture should not cause us to expect people to be like robots who are deploying an instruction set. It should cause us to see people as people deploying stories because it's a much more efficient way of doing things. So now I want to try a little thought experiment that I think is useful. Yes, why am I showing you an elevator button panel? Here's the thought experiment. Imagine that we had a modern city, doesn't matter where it is, and for the purposes of this thought experiment, without injuring anybody, we purge all of the people from this modern city, but we leave it functional. And we import some hunter-gatherers, some group from 20,000 years ago, has fire, has some flint tools, but no experience of modern technology. And let's say that once a day, we arrange to provide them everything they need, all the food they could possibly need. We drop it someplace that they will find it, and they don't have to worry about feeding themselves in this modern environment. They can just explore it. Well, what's going to happen when they encounter an elevator? Are they going to figure it out? Kind of, is the answer. They will discover that you can push a button and a light comes on, and then they will discover there's some sort of a box there. And if they get in, it may frighten them the first time. They get in, the box closes, they don't know what to do. Maybe they push another button. Whoa, what's happening? The box opens again. They're not in the same place. They get to the window, they recognize where they are. They're just higher up in the building. So the point is, there's a part of this that's totally comprehensible that you could work out. I mean, hunter-gatherers are as cognitively capable as we are. They would figure out that by pressing buttons, you could get the box to show up, that the box would take you someplace, it would drop you off, and that actually the particular button you pushed decided how high up in the building you went. Would they figure out how it worked at a mechanistic level? No. I mean, most of us don't really know. Can you describe how an electric motor works? It's tough. So what we know is that understanding how something works comes in different levels. There's the how do I interact with this thing? That level's actually fairly easy. And then there's the what actually explains this? That's actually pretty hard, but not key to functioning in this location. So my point is that actually the elevator will present them a particular kind of puzzle. Think about what deliberations would sound like for people who'd never encountered something like an elevator as they were trying to figure out what the heck this thing was. You push a button and you rise up into the sky. Maybe the force you are applying to the button is proportional to how high you go in the building. Nope, that doesn't work. So there's something weird about it does require a force, but that force is not proportional to the consequence. What works like that? You know what works like that? Animals. You can urge a horse on, and then you can travel across the night alerting people that the British are coming, right? The amount of force that you put into the kick that set the horse running through the night is not proportional to the horse's distance or speed, right? Maybe a little, but not a lot. Now, there's a very good reason for this. It's not breaking any laws of physics. There's chemical energy stored in the horse, and the horse is releasing it because you've actually communicated some information to the horse about what you want done, etc. So that is something we can explain, but you don't need to understand how chemical energy is stored in a horse in order to operate one. So my point is, when human beings come up with stories to explain features of the universe that they can't understand because they don't have the scientific grounding to figure out exactly how they work, they come up with something narrative that fits. And it is not surprising that they land first on animals and then they land on the special case of people, right? A person can have quirks. You might have an uncle that flies into a rage at the mention of something. Right? It's not proportional to the amount of energy in what you said. Your uncle has a predisposition to not want to talk about that thing. So people and animals break these physical rules, not because they're breaking laws of the universe, but because they have quirks. And so if you are a person trying to take the wisdom that you have just discovered about how to operate in some landscape, and you're trying to package it into stories that are compelling and realistic enough to be remembered and passed on, it's not surprising that these stories focus on people and animals because those things are quirky enough for you to tell any story you need to tell. All right, so the elevator, its behavior might be attributed to a god who had some opinion about what happens when you press one button or another. That would explain the odd behavior of the elevator in a way that a parent hunter-gatherer could explain it to a kid hunter-gatherer enough that the kid hunter-gatherer would know how to interact with it. And that leads us to phenomena like this, these grand stories that allow us to explain things that are counterintuitive. So, for example, if we were thinking about a lineage living in some sort of town, and that lineage was composed of people who largely had shared interests with each other, shared fate, as Heather mentioned, but there's always tensions, there's competition within a town, there's betrayal, and those things threaten to have material impacts on the well-being of the entire lineage represented by that town. So there is something deep to explain. If you cheat on your spouse, it might result in a breakdown in trust within the town sufficient to interfere with our ability to harvest food sufficient to get us through the winter. So your cheating might result in starvation. That's a hard thing to explain. But you can say something like, you're not going to get away with it because there's somebody who sees everything you do and everything you think. And that person is keeping track. And at the end of the day, it's going to come back to haunt you. It's not worth it, right? That is a story that makes a great deal of sense, and it stands in for a truth that's very hard to convey, right? The subtle connection between moral betrayal and starvation is not a sticky story, but a story of somebody who has opinions about your behavior down on earth and has the power to know all of the things that you do. That is a very intuitive story. Right? It's not unlike a parent who knows what a child does, who knows when the child is lying. So I do not in any way mean to trivialize the myths that have brought humanity to this place. In fact, quite the opposite. Those myths are the key to our success. It is not reasonable to treat them as mind viruses or as ephemera. They are neither. They are crucial adaptations fundamental to human success. And once we understand that, we will begin to understand the conundrum of modernity. Because unfortunately for us, the rate of technological change that we have set in motion is altering our environment so quickly that the stories that we have depended on to keep us out of trouble are not up to date. We do not have myths that tell us what to think about AI or the enrichment of uranium, right? Those things were not written into the sacred texts, and so we don't have guidance, and that is putting us in grave jeopardy. So niche switching is the human niche. Niche switching, the ability to oscillate between a cultural mode that you inherit from the ancestors and a conscious mode in which you solve problems that the ancestors don't know how to address. That allows you to move from one niche to another. It allows you to move through time as things change, and it allows you to move across space where things that work over there don't work over here. And it has resulted in an odd phenomenon. I mentioned that if I name an animal, or any species, that I have effectively pointed to a niche because the relationship is one-to-one. An animal has a niche. Humans have many niches. And what that means is that human beings, although we are one species at a genetic level, we function like many species at an ecological level. That has interesting implications. It has interesting implications for the way we treat each other. We do have aspects that function more or less like we're different species. How likely are you to fall in love with and reproduce with somebody with whom you do not share a language? It's not impossible. It happens, but it's very, very rare. So there is a mating barrier that arises from language. Whereas, I would point out, Language is an excellent test case for the question of how adaptive material is transmitted between generations. Is language genetic? Is it cultural? Well, in this case, we actually know. You are built to acquire a language. You are built to acquire the language that you hear as a child. There is no bias whatsoever that anyone has ever found toward a particular language. You are born at the language level as a blank slate. You'll acquire that which is spoken around you, but you will acquire a language. If your ears work and your mind works, you will acquire it. So is language genetic? Well, the predisposition to acquire one sure is. Is it cultural? Yeah, the grammar, the content of the language is entirely cultural. So this is a composite adaptation. Should that trouble us when we try to figure out how much of this is about our genes? No, we know the answer to that question. Acquiring a language is about getting your genes into the future. That's what it's there for. That's what these stories are there for, these myths. We acquire them because knowing them allows us to efficiently know how to function in the world. And so you can begin to see how understanding how evolution appears to have created us gives us a great deal of leverage, even if our focus is over in the humanities, even if we are much more fascinated by human behavior and human flourishing than we are by plants in the jungle or animals on the savannah. And with that, I will just say I greatly look forward to the discussion that I have a feeling is about to happen.
Thank you. If hypernovelty continues at the rate that it's at now, it seems that what is needed is not just a new culture, but a new kind of culture, in the sense of a culture that prepares generations to deal with what will inevitably continue to be hypernovel. So what ideas do you have about what that kind of culture could look like? Because it seems what we need is not just a new culture, but a culture of consciousness in some sense.
I think you've said that very well. A culture of consciousness would be the right starting point. I also strongly suspect that if we are to survive, we are going to have to rein in the rate of change, that we are actually suffering from a feature of the market. We are a victim of its success at discovering new things that we can do. And you never want to have a scenario where the world that you are an adult in is not like the world where you were a child, because that by definition means you will be out of your depth. We now live in that world constantly. So my guess is we're going to have to figure out, A, how to protect children. It's positively insane that we expose them to all of these new things before we have any idea what their impact is going to be. That doesn't make a whit of sense. But it is also important, we could create a new kind of schooling in which kids were confronted by a series of novel puzzles, and we basically built that muscle to deal with new circumstances, to intuit that something might be dangerous that seems like it isn't, that sort of thing. But I would bet that reining in the rate of change is going to be key to stabilizing humanity.
Yeah, I don't know how we do it, but I think one of the things that almost everyone, maybe everyone I've ever talked to about it, does value, even if they can't figure out how to get there, is well-made things, the value of craft, hand-wrought things by actual human beings, as opposed to the stuff you can buy at IKEA. And many people will say, well, I can't afford it. I can't afford the beautiful things. Well, but if people are making the things, and you know people, and you develop a culture of exchange, and the economy doesn't need to be based on that culture of exchange, but maybe I am growing chickens and you are making cutting boards. And I do love fresh eggs, and you do want a beautiful piece of wood on which to cut your meat. I think almost everyone has these values, and we haven't figured out how to not walk into Target or IKEA or Walmart. even though we actually know what we prefer. So there's something there, although I don't know how we get there.
Yes, thank you for the wonderful lecture. I really appreciated the point that you made, Dr. Hein, about the mechanistic ideology that seems to have possessed our world. And it does seem that this mechanistic ideology to a lot of people is what characterizes science, that we explain higher order phenomena in terms of lower order phenomena. And you said that this isn't science, and I guess I wanted to ask, how would you account for this mechanistic ideology? What is science? And tangentially, you've also mentioned, we are made for a world that we no longer inhabit. And I wanted to ask, what do you think that world would look like? I think all of these things have something to do with each other, so thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll start. I think the mechanistic ideology is appealing. The certainty, which is alluring, evades the question of that thing that you measured, was it the right thing? Was the thing that you measured the thing you should have been measuring in the first place? And having measured it, have you actually obscured the question you should have been asking? So thinking more broadly about what questions should we be asking, are there questions that are worth asking that have immeasurable answers? Of course there are. Are some of those questions indeed even scientific? Yes, to that too. How can we, and this is more broadly like what is science, actual science, as opposed to what is passing for science right now? How can we embrace uncertainty sufficient that even the people who are dealing with explicitly quantitative things can back off sometimes and say, yeah, I did count it and I do know how many there are, but there's a good chance actually that I measured the wrong thing.
So if I might add two things, I'll try to remember both of them. The issue of our scientific culture being broken, and actually our analytical culture is really the problem, in large measure frequently comes down to a failure to understand that you have crossed an important threshold when you go from the highly complicated to the complex. Complex systems, and most especially complex adaptive systems, which is all of biology, those systems are fundamentally unpredictable, and it requires a level of humility because we don't understand nearly enough to operate there as experts. It's impossible to be one. So keep an eye out for people who have gotten very good at thinking about complicated things who then are headed for a fall when they cross that threshold. As for what the world should look like, I would say there are a few major leverage points. One, sustainability. We don't have the right to give future generations a lesser world than we inherited. It should be at least as good when we hand it off as it was when we got it, right? So that's something that we should be targeting. Two, and this is related, thought experiment. If you could internalize every externality in the economy, that is to say, you could deliver all of the costs of an action back to the person who decided to make the action. If you could do that, you would need to do almost no other governance. The system would fix itself, right? If you paid the cost for your own decisions, the system would fix itself because you would end up only doing those things in the market that actually made us wealthier, right? If you're destroying wealth because it makes your bank account bigger, that shouldn't be. Right? If your bank account shrinks, you'll stop doing it. We don't need to do very much. So those two things are very important. And then the last one, we need, I've hopefully convinced you all that lineage plays a huge role in how we got here and that our genes are obsessed with it. We have a choice, though. It is also evolutionarily valid to build a civilization, as the West has done, based on putting lineage aside and collaborating based on reciprocity. I think the only way that humanity is here 500 years from now is if we stabilize the desire to put lineage aside and collaborate based on the profitability of reciprocity. If we don't, it's just a matter of time.
Bret and Heather, first, let me just thank you. You're really heroic figures to me. Thank you for your brave stand at Evergreen and during the COVID fiasco. From the heart.
Thank you.
You're here.
Let me just say, I appreciate you saying that. It means a tremendous amount to get that feedback, because of course, as it was happening, who's to say what anybody thinks about it?
But trust me, that was from the heart. And clearly, I speak for many people. My pithy question is it possible that the urge to life, which is the springboard of evolution after all, exists to continued life on this earth, exists in parallel with another urge, call it a higher urge, toward the divine that explains things like the medieval cathedral, the great cathedrals of the late Middle Ages? Would you rule out? Do you intellectually rule out the possibility that there is that separate, coexistent urge toward the divine?
I wouldn't rule anything out. It's all on the table of possibilities, but I would say, to me, logically speaking, one of two things has to be true. Either selection and the process of adaptation created that urge to the divine. It created our tendency to see a spirit world because it benefits us to do so. Either that is true, or, less likely from my perspective, there is some creator force, and that creator force then, this is the bitter pill, that creator force used selection to build all of this. In other words, what I don't see is any room for special creation, where a creator sat down at a drawing board and decided what creatures were supposed to be there. I think, were it true that there were some higher realm, then the point is, well, he built an evolution simulator because he was interested in what it would produce, which, again, that's not my instinct, but I'm open to that possibility. I guess there's a third, which is that this is a cruel joke. But no, I mean, really, it could be that, that a divine creator gave us a ton of evolution for natural selection in hopes of tricking us into mistakenly coming to that conclusion. I can't rule that out, but I do know there's an awful lot of evidence for natural selection, and so I don't see that a creator could fault me for following it to the logical conclusion. It's the reasonable thing to do.
Let me just follow up with that by asking, it's a very powerful analysis you give, which is that the genes want to throw themselves into the future, and you might say evolution is precisely has the teleology of survival. It is itself it is an ever evolving mode of adapting oneself to what is real. That is to say, whether that's reciprocity with being able to have food source or reproduce or whatever. And so what I'd like to ask you is, do you see principles or categories of things that seem to, as it were, be ways of grouping what that fitness looks like, whether it's reciprocity, whether it's ability to adapt? I'm trying to see what are you might say, as with the laws of physics, what can we sort of see are the range of possibilities that you're correctly fitting into leads to it working out?
I think I get your question.
I admit it was not very well phrased.
Well, I mean, it's a rough one. I think it's an important thread to go down. I'm a very, I hate to say it, a very unspiritual person. I've tried, I've failed. I'm not spiritual. But as I do analytical work, I keep finding myself landing on stuff that sounds like Buddhism. And I suspect that there's a kind of a reason for it, which is the ground floor. There really isn't an argument. It's going to sound wrong, but there isn't an argument that being alive is better than being dead, right? There's not a well-grounded philosophical argument for that. But we're all convinced that it's better because we are the descendant of a huge number of generations that were confused in exactly that same way. And it's not surprising that we've inherited their exact bias and have a preference for being alive. And I think it's great. But once you land there and you decide that actually, you know what, I'm going to take my next breath. I'm going to try to stay alive as long as possible. I'm going to try to modify the world in ways that I think make it better. Once you start doing that, you realize that others have that right and that we have an obligation to deliver the opportunity to them. And therefore, the thing that the genes want to do, they selfishly want to get into the future no matter what. And really, we haven't begun to plumb the depths of how awful what the genes will do in pursuit of that goal is. But once we, as individuals who have values, start figuring out what we want to do with the opportunity that the genes accidentally gave us, well, we can impose our values on them. And we can actually modify the game in a way that if the genes were wise, they would like, because it actually increases the chances that the genes actually make it 2,000 more years, 3,000 more years. So if they got it, if they were wise, they'd want us to do it. And we have the power, whether they like it or not, to override their instincts. And frankly, I just don't know what else we would do. Once we've come to understand what we are and what we're predisposed towards, why wouldn't we take command over, we take control away from the genes and say, you know what, we really are done with genocide and war. We understand what those things are. We come up with a reason to go to battle with each other. We make up reasons, but that's really about genes displacing each other, and it's a pointless, stupid game. We can end it if we know what it is, and so we can spot it, and we know what conditions set it in motion so we can prevent those conditions from arising again. And from my perspective, once you see that, it's the only thing to try to do. Nothing else has any durable purpose because we're in too much jeopardy until we arrest that process.
One of the things that when you addressed, if you look at Joseph Campbell's The Masks of God, you see humankind trying to describe what is the unknown and the way he does it. But what I want to go to is, in relation to that, is humankind and nature and humankind in nature. One is the exploitation, the former, in which we kill the buffalo till they're gone, the whales, etc., for our use. Man in nature, shown by Alexander von Humboldt, and how he brought this inner nature to us. In our society today, are we losing that consciousness of being together? And given the society of this country, I'm not talking about the rest of the world, is there any chance that this can be renewed?
I would say one of the tremendously underrated leverage points is child development. And as much as we all know it's important, these problems are very difficult to address in adulthood. But if we were to put our minds to creating childhood environments that teach valuable lessons about, for example, exactly that, then the adults would have them on board by the time these kids reached adulthood. So personally, I'm very eager to see us completely revamp education, because what we currently have is inadequate to the task of raising modern people, and it's, in my opinion, probably unrescuable. If you just try to reform it, you won't get there. It really needs a fresh sheet of paper, and from there, maybe there's hope.
Heather, please.
Yeah, I would just add, your framing was man and nature and man in nature. And to me, the missing option is man of nature, that we are in it because we are of it. And that is an evolutionary rather than an inherently religious perspective, of course. But I think it also resolves some of the conflict around, why isn't it our right to just destroy the things? Well, we are the things. We are found, part of us is found in all of it. And so we are in fact destroying parts of ourselves as we destroy what is nature.
Your last question, Professor Weinstein, about what's the future here of our civilization? We have AI, we have nuclear bombs, so many things. I wanted to present Arthur Peacock's theory, kind of concept, how to think about evolution, which was, he drew an analogy with Bach's Fugue. A fugue is a piece of music that's rule-bound, but it also has space for improvisation within it. Could we think about, I want to hear your critical feedback from both of you about this, can we think about evolution in the same way? There's rules to it. There's genetic rules, natural selection, environments, but there's also a lot of space for improvisation within those rules. And how to maximize that improvisation, I'd like to quote a musician, Phil Lesh, who recently died. It's the best way to play a fugue is by listening to the other players and responding. It's hearing one another.
That's good.
I think that's a tremendously good metaphor. And one thing I took out of yesterday's talk that I now regret taking out is the degree to which we can bend or break any particular evolutionary drive is arbitrary. So there are certain things that we are hopelessly condemned to do because of the way that they are built into us. And there are other things that are built into us, but were built in a way that makes it trivially easy to change. And to give you one example, selection made the act of sex pleasurable, not the act of reproduction. And in fact, human beings are special in that sex is not inherently reproductive. It is obviously the mechanism of reproduction, but human beings have sex when they are not fertile, and that is an adaptation. It's actually a gift that the universe gave us. But the fact that sex and reproduction are separable actually allows us to decide when to have a family, how big a family to have, if we should have a family. And that means that we are in a position to alter that landscape very easily. But you're not in nearly as good a position to alter your sex drive, right? It's just an accident of the fact that it isn't the fertilization of an egg that's pleasurable, right? It's just arbitrary. So what we want is to look at a map of all of our characteristics and say, very much as you're suggesting, which of these things are amenable to our reimagining them, and which of these things should we just accept because it would be too difficult to alter them? And if you knew that, you'd stop struggling so much against the stuff you can't change, and you would spend your time on the things that actually you have a pretty good chance of reorganizing them so they'd be better.
The one response I have, never having heard this before, but having been a classical pianist for many years, is, I forgot that fugues had that improvisation aspect to it. Bach, really? I would have thought this would have been in Chopin. So we can find improvisation, we can find the plasticity, the flexibility, even in the places that seem the most regimented. And maybe that's the lesson that we should take from that metaphor, which I do think is apt as a metaphor for evolution.
Well, thank you to you both for such a fascinating and indeed provocative series of lectures, as our questions have well evidenced. Just a brief question to close. If fundamentally your understanding of our world and indeed our universe is that a given species with particular characteristics and adaptations ultimately has those as an adaptive evolutionary response to propel themselves into the future, why is it that humans, either uniquely or at least as far as we can tell in particular, are drawn irrationally to beauty? And if we leave aside the obvious beauty of our fellow species and instead think of the beauty of the natural world, what might be the adaptive evolutionary advantage of humankind universally finding, say, a sunset or the stars an object of ineffable beauty?
It's a great question. There's actually a certain amount of work on this, and the two examples you've picked are hard to figure in light of this. But the work suggests that beauty is often a proxy to value. And I hate to put it in those terms, but if you were looking for a new place for your tribe to settle, you might use the beauty of a particular landscape as an indicator that it was the sort of place in which a living could be had. A place that was tangled up in broken trees might indicate that this was a place in which the storms are ferocious, whereas some place that the trees had grown up and looked healthy and had limbs of many different sizes might indicate that the weather was gentle. So you could imagine
the universal love of water features would seem to fit with this, right? That that's a very useful thing if you want to survive.
Yeah. This is the reason that I presented tautology as so useful, is if we can stop arguing about what creatures are trying to do, if we say, let's get genes into the future, period, the end, that can be lineage level genes or individual genes because an individual is a lineage. But then the question is, we can look at all of the things that they're doing and saying, how the heck does that accomplish this goal? And we're left with paradoxes, which tells us what we need to resolve. And that's, I think, a much better way of cataloging adaptations, figuring out what it is that you don't yet understand. And I will just say, for example, the beauty of the mating displays of many birds are, in a weird way, still not explained. We know, for example, if we take the peafowl, we know why the peacock has the big tail, because the females won't mate with him if he doesn't have a big, impressive tail. What we don't know is why the females require it, and we have frankly settled for explanations that just aren't up to the challenge. Probably, the females are actually standing in for a hazard to lineage that is not evident in the present moment. And so the point is, the beautiful display is what we would call an honest indicator of a capacity, something resident in the genes that females are trying to assess, because it is vitally important to their lineages that this characteristic be present in as large a quantity as possible. So anyway, I would just guess beauty, wherever we find it, if it is some kind of resonant, especially a universal, it is a proxy for something vitally important, and it would be wise for us to figure out what it is.
So I think I'll take a different tack, which is the night sky, the stars. I wonder what each of us is thinking as we gaze at the night sky. Is it the same thing as when you look at a beautiful human being or a flower? I think our experiences of beauty, there is not one beauty, right? And so we use that term, which works for all of the forms of beauty, but there's actually not just one thing. And of course, there are probably, there's a deep philosophy of aesthetics out there that I once knew something about, but have mostly forgotten. The night sky feels to me, like, what am I thinking when I'm gazing at the night sky? It is a combination of awe and wonder, and yes, a sense of that is extraordinarily beautiful, and I am so small, which is also, I think, part of what is evoked with the sunset, with looking at the ocean. While views across water that have land in them are often very beautiful, they are not as awe-inspiring as an open ocean. They don't give the same sense of, oh, I am not all that important after all. And I think that can usefully be wrapped up in our understanding of what beauty is, because it helps us discover meaning. Truth and beauty are tied together many times throughout history, and I think that makes sense. So, what are we as scientists interested in, and as artists and as humanists and everyone, I think, but specifically in science, we're trying to figure out what's true. And often beauty, to return to what you were saying, Bret, often beauty will be an indicator of what's true, if it's the peacock's tail, but it may also be just a pointer, like consider this more. I don't know what the question is yet, but consider this more.
In a way, this is a very lovely place for us to conclude this series, this whole question of whether there are things in themselves, beauty and truth, that our love of which can simply be subordinated to the pushing of our genes into the future, or whether the very persistence of those things, regardless of whether we understand them or not, and our love for them is indicative of something more. This is...
I can't resist. Where I started my talk, you are beautifully designed for a world that you do not live in. If you were living in a world that was appropriate to your design, one of the things that would be true about it is that you would need to be a lot less conscious, which may sound awkward to people who enjoy intellectualizing things, which probably you do, or you wouldn't be here. But I think it would be a much better existence, because what it means is that you could point your conscious mind at a smaller number of puzzles that were much more consequential, and you could flow through the rest of your life based on a well-tutored intuition about what was good and what was bad. And so in some sense, I think it is important at this moment in history that we do think about these puzzles very deeply, because we're in danger of hurting ourselves. But it would be better, I would much rather live in that world where we didn't have to think so deliberately, because we were basically in a society that worked pretty well, and we could reserve our conscious mind for, puzzles that were worthy of us.
That is so well said. I think it's true to say that it took about 200,000 years of evolution for us to move from our ancestors in Africa to now. But it took only 200 years of conscious cultural evolution to move us from, farm rural dwellers to city dwellers. And you've spoken very beautifully both about our embeddedness, with whether it's grief and reciprocity and education and so on, within the long course of evolution and other species. And also, Bret, you, I think, very compellingly about the increased rate of change to which we, in some sense, are not adapted. We're not ready for this in some way. And yet, maybe that the freedom of the human mind, that freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry is the ultimate tool for adapting ourselves in relation to what is real, what is true, what is going to work. And I want to thank you both. Here we stand at a dizzying moment in the history, at least of human civilization. And it doesn't seem to me there's any way we can find ourselves without being able to consciously to do their best to understand where we've come from, what we are, in order to be able to chart so best as we possibly can where we're going. And I want to thank you both, Bret and Heather, for the help you've given us to do that. Thank you.